The winter sun in Texas. 1944 hung low and cold above the wire fences of Camp Hearne. Inside the compound, German prisoners of war, once soldiers of the Reich, now stood in drab fatigues, watching through the mesh as American soldiers tended to a strange ritual. There was laughter, smoke, and the unmistakable crackle of oil on a makeshift stove. A young American private in a wool cap tossed slices of potatoes in a cast-iron pan, their edges turning golden in the light. The Germans broke into laughter. To them, it was absurd, this sight of men in uniform playing with food while war still raged across Europe. One of them, Oberfeldwebel Otto Brandt, once a tank mechanic from Hamburg, smirked and said in his diary, "They turn the battlefield into a kitchen. We fight for order and discipline. They fight with grease and fire." Others joined in, scoffing, their pride intact even behind barbed wire. They had been told in training that Americans were soft, spoiled by abundance back home. Propaganda reels had shown them clumsy GIs eating chocolate and chewing gum like children. The idea that these men, these fry cooks in uniform, had defeated the Wehrmacht felt like a personal insult. "Look at them," one officer muttered. "They laugh while Europe burns." Yet behind the humor lay something darker, an unease no one admitted for the first time. The Germans saw victors who did not gloat, who cooked instead of shouting orders, who treated the war like a distant storm that could be ignored for one brief human moment. The sound of sizzling oil carried strangely in the still air, mingling with the metallic clang of the camp gates. For a second, even the guards looked distracted, noses twitching at the scent of something simple, something ordinary. Fried potatoes, crisping in oil, filling the camp with a smell that didn't belong to war. Some POWs whispered among themselves, mocking what they saw as American childishness. Others, silent, stared longer than they meant to. There was something hypnotic in the ordinary rhythm of the pan. A war built on pride and hierarchy had suddenly met the humble sound of a kitchen. And so, in that small corner of Texas, a strange kind of laughter echoed through the camp, not the laughter of joy, but of disbelief, of men clinging to pride because it was the last weapon they had left. They did not yet know that what they mocked would soon disarm them more deeply than any bullet could. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? At dusk. The camp grew quieter. The desert wind blew fine dust across the compound, carrying the faint hum of generators and the creak of wooden guard towers. Inside the wire, German prisoners stood in small knots, watching again as the Americans gathered around their mess area. It was time for supper. There was nothing extravagant about it, just a few soldiers. A small fire, and the same pan of potatoes now joined by onions and bits of bacon sizzling in the mix. Yet the atmosphere was entirely different from what the prisoners expected of the enemy. The Americans talked loudly, laughed easily, traded stories about their hometowns Kansas, Ohio, Maine. One spoke of his wife's pie. Another joked about learning to cook only after joining the army. Oberleutnant Franz Keller, who once commanded a panzer platoon in Normandy, watched through the fence, arms folded, expression unreadable. "They eat like farmers," he murmured to his fellow officer. No order, no formality, but his tone carried less contempt than before, almost confusion. In the fading light, the flicker of the stove reflected on the Americans' faces, and for a brief moment, it didn't look like war at all. Beyond the barbed wire, the scene took on an uncanny gentleness. The guards didn't shout. The cooks didn't rush. A few men hummed songs, fragments of country tunes carried across the cold air to the Germans. It was a strange sight. Soldiers who could afford to laugh. Men who could still be human while fighting a world war. Inside the barracks, Corporal Dieter Voss wrote in his hidden notebook that night, "They laugh as if nothing weighs on them. We used to sing, too, before the war became endless." He paused before adding a second line, "Maybe this is their strength. They remember how to live." That same evening, one American private, thin, red-haired, no older than 20, waved at the prisoners through the fence, holding up his fork in greeting. Some Germans turned away, pretending not to see. Others nodded silently, unsure why. The light from the American kitchen spread softly across the camp, throwing long shadows on the frozen ground. The prisoners lay in their bunks later, unable to sleep. hearing the fading echoes of laughter outside. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was something else, something unsettlingly warm. To the men who had fought through Stalingrad and Normandy, this ordinary supper felt more foreign than any weapon. It was a reminder of a life that had gone missing somewhere between glory and ruin. And as the last potato crisped in the pan and the laughter died into the Texas night, even the proudest officers could not shake one thought that perhaps the enemy had not only won the war of arms, but also the war of spirit. By the next morning, the camp had returned to its rhythm roll calls, drills, long hours of monotony. Yet something lingered in the air, invisible but undeniable. When the kitchen fires were lit again, the first scent of hot oil drifted across the open yard. This time, no one laughed. It was late December 1944, and even in Texas, the cold bit deep. Frost dusted the fences, boots left pale prints on the frozen dirt. The camp's kitchen stood near the western edge, beside the laundry shed. From its doorway, steam curled into the sky, carrying the unmistakable smell of frying potatoes mixed with bacon fat and onions. Inside the barracks, someone whispered, "They're cooking again." The words spread like a ripple. Men lifted their heads from cots for a moment. They weren't prisoners, just sons, brothers, husbands suddenly ambushed by memory. Unteroffizier Karl Reinhardt, who had served on the Eastern Front, stared at the rising smoke and felt a sudden ache. In his pocket lay a creased letter from his mother. Sent before Stalingrad fell, she had written, "When the frost comes, I'll fry potatoes with apples, your favorite." He'd read it so many times the ink had faded. Yet, that morning, the air outside smelled exactly like that letter. Nearby, a young guard named Private Harold Burns noticed the prisoner's silence. "Funny," he said to another cook. "They're quieter when we fry stuff." His friend shrugged, tossing another handful of sliced potatoes into the pan. "Smell travels better than orders," he joked. Neither man realized that their ordinary work was stirring ghosts in the barracks beyond. One prisoner closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Another muttered in disbelief, "It smells German." It was true, the scent of potatoes frying in oil was universal, belonging to no flag. It crossed barbed wire as easily as air, dissolving the distance between enemy and home. From his bunk, Keller finally sat up, rubbing his temples. The laughter from 2 days earlier felt distant, childish. "This smell," he said quietly, "is dangerous." By noon, the scent had woven itself through the entire camp. Even the guards ate slower, taking longer looks toward the kitchens. A few POWs exchanged glances that seemed to say, "We remember too." That evening, when the fires burned down and the pans cooled, the smell lingered faint, sweet, almost tender. The prisoners spoke little at dinner, their canned rations tasteless compared to what they had imagined all day. Somewhere beyond the fence, an American cook poured out the last of the oil, the hiss echoing like a sigh. For the first time since capture, many of the Germans felt something unexpected, not hunger, not envy, but homesickness. Carried on the scent of a stranger's meal. The next turning point came quietly, without ceremony or command. One late afternoon, the wind had died, and a thin layer of frost coated the barbed wire. From the kitchen yard, Private Harold Burns appeared again, sleeves rolled, face flushed from heat. In his hands, he carried a dented tray lined with paper, stacked high with fried potatoes still steaming from the pan. At first, the German prisoners only stared. A few chuckled, thinking it a joke. "He's taunting us," someone said, but Burns didn't speak. He set the tray on a low wooden crate near the fence and stepped back, nodding once toward the group before walking away. Silence fell. The smell hung heavy salt, grease, warmth, the kind that stirs both comfort and caution. No one moved. Finally, a corporal named Hans Weber stepped forward. He had been a baker in Leipzig before the war. Hunger gnawed harder than pride, and curiosity broke his hesitation. He reached through the wire and picked up a single slice. It was still hot enough to sting his fingers. He hesitated, then bit. The crunch was soft but final, a small sound that shifted everything. His face changed. "It's real," he whispered. "It tastes like home." The others watched. Some shook their heads, refusing. Others stepped closer. Soon, Another hand reached out, then another. No one said a word. Each man who tasted felt something melt, not just in the mouth, but in the mind. The food they had mocked now felt sacred. From the guard post, an American soldier laughed gently. "Guess they're not so proud after all," he said. But there was no cruelty in his tone, only understanding. That night, in the barracks, Weber scribbled a line in his notebook before lights out. "I have eaten the enemy's food. It was warm, and it was human. The world is not as simple as I was told." Oberleutnant Keller read the note silently and folded it shut. "Don't lose it," he said. "One day, that will be proof that we were still men." In the mess area, the Americans had already finished their own meal. Burns washed the pan, wiping it clean with a rag. He looked up once at the camp, seeing faint figures in the barracks windows, then went back to work. The war outside raged on Bastonia was under siege, and Europe was burning, but here, on this cold evening in Texas, one act of quiet generosity had bridged a gulf that years of propaganda could not fill. No headlines would ever mention it, no medals would be given. Yet history, if it had a scent, would have smelled like this oil, smoke, and a thin wisp of understanding rising through winter air. That night, snow came unexpectedly, a rare curtain of white across the Texas plains. It softened the sounds of the camp, the barking of dogs, the clatter of boots, even the moan of the wind. Inside the barracks, the prisoners lay awake beneath their thin blankets, breath turning to mist in the cold air. Hunger murmured softly through the silence. But something else lingered too, the ghost of warmth from that plate of fried potatoes shared across the fence. At midnight, someone produced a tin can from under his cot. Inside were 3 slices of those same potatoes, now cold and limp, smuggled in during evening roll call. No one spoke as the men gathered around. Their faces were hollow, their eyes alert, as if they were guarding a relic. Weber cut a slice in 2 and passed it to Keller. Another man broke off a small corner, pressing it into his palm as if holding something sacred. They ate slowly, chewing in near silence, each bite echoing faintly through the wooden barracks. Outside, the guards' lanterns swayed in the wind, but the snow muffled everything. The faint crunch underfoot, the hiss of breath through frost, all mixed with the memory of that smell. For the first time in months, the prisoners did not curse their hunger. The food was gone quickly, but the warmth it brought stayed long after. No one called it kindness. No one dared. To do so would have meant surrendering more than pride. It would mean admitting the enemy had shown mercy. And yet, in their own way, they already had. A diary later found after the war, unsigned but believed to be Keller's, contained a single line about that night. "It was the quietest supper of my life. I think I heard my own soul eat." The guards, unaware, huddled in their own hut, drinking weak coffee, joking about the weather. Burns rubbed his hands near a small stove, wondering aloud if the Krauts would ever taste freedom again. His friend shrugged. "Maybe they already did," he said, staring out toward the darkened barracks. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The camp looked strangely peaceful, fences glistening, footprints erased, chimneys still smoking. In that hush, something had changed. The prisoners no longer looked toward the kitchens with mockery or envy. They looked with recognition, and as the sky brightened into pale blue, a question hung between the 2 sides of the wire, silent, persistent, almost human. If a simple meal could bridge a war, what else might men have shared? Had they not been taught to hate? By late January 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its bloody climax. But in Texas, the rhythm of captivity had softened. Snow melted into mud, and in the mornings, steam still rose from the camp kitchens. The smell of frying potatoes returned, but this time, it carried no mockery, no barrier. Something wordless had shifted. One morning, Sergeant Harold Burns leaned on the counter, watching the line of prisoners marching toward the work sheds. He had seen them for months, proud men made small by defeat yet lately. Their eyes met his with quiet steadiness, not hostility, on a whim. He turned to his crew and said, "Maybe let a few of them help in the kitchen today." The camp commander hesitated but agreed. By afternoon, 3 German POWs stood awkwardly by the stoves. Unsure where to begin, Weber recognized the smell instantly, the same frying oil that had haunted their nights. Burns handed him a spatula. "Don't just stand there," he grinned. "Show me how you do it in Leipzig." At first, the work was mechanical slice, Stir, turn, drain, but soon rhythm took over. Oil hissed, potatoes sizzled, onions browned. The Americans and Germans moved around each other with quiet understanding, bound by routine more than language. Someone laughed, not cruelly, but freely, and the sound startled even them. By evening, the two groups stood shoulder to shoulder, serving the same meal to guards and prisoners alike. The smell filled every corner of the camp, thick, warm, forgiving. Even Keller, who had once mocked the sight of frying food, sat beside Burns at the long wooden table. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. As the plates emptied, conversation began to flow. Burns told stories about his home in Iowa. Weber spoke softly of his mother's kitchen. The two men discovered that their towns both bordered wide rivers, one called the Mississippi, the other the Elbe. They compared them like old friends. In the barracks that night, laughter returned, quieter, humbler, but genuine. Some prisoners still refused to touch the food, clinging to dignity. Others ate, slowly and silently. A note passed between bunks read, "We are learning to cook with our captors. The world has turned upside down." For once, the Americans didn't see enemies, and the Germans didn't see conquerors. What they saw and smelled was survival made human. Tell me, if you had been there standing by that stove, hearing the oil hiss, watching men once divided by war sharing one meal, would you have tasted it, or would you have turned away? When the war finally ended, the world moved on faster than the men inside Camp Hearne could understand. Trains carried them away in slow, endless waves back across the ocean, back to cities in ruins. Yet even years later, when the noise of bombs had faded into history, a single smell could summon everything back. In 1953, in a quiet corner of Kassel, a small museum opened an exhibit about wartime captivity. Among the artifacts, rusted mess tins, torn letters, a dented frying pan labeled U.S. Army Field Kitchen, 1944. Next to it, a handwritten card read, "Donated by former POW Hans Weber." Visitors rarely noticed it. To most, it was just another object. But to Weber, it was the only piece of that winter he could still touch. When reporters asked why he kept it, he smiled faintly, because it smelled like forgiveness. He said, "Like oil and smoke and something good we didn't deserve." Back then, the world called it re-education. The Americans called it hospitality. But to the men who had lived through it, it was simply a quiet rediscovery of being human. Many who survived Camp Hearne wrote later that they had expected cruelty, yet what they remembered most was warmth, the smell of potatoes, and the laughter of men who could afford to share. Oberleutnant Franz Keller, who became a teacher after the war, kept a single photograph in his desk, a black and white shot of soldiers cooking outside the camp kitchen. In the corner of the frame, smoke rises gently into a pale winter sky. On the back, he had written, "This was the day I stopped hating." That memory, passed down in diaries and letters, outlasted victory parades and monuments. It lived not in medals or history books, but in something smaller, a scent, a taste, a shared silence. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it, the faint hiss of oil, the scrape of a spatula, the murmured laughter of men who had forgotten which side of the wire they stood on. And perhaps, somewhere in that drifting smell, lies the simplest truth of all, that peace is not declared in treaties, but born quietly, pan by pan, in the hearts of those willing to share what little warmth they have left. Years later, when the veterans of both sides grew old, many still spoke of that winter not as defeat or captivity, but as awakening. They remembered the camp lights flickering through the frost, the wind carrying the smell of fried potatoes, and how something as simple as food had made strangers recognize each other again. It was not a story of grand battles or generals, but of small mercies that refused to die, in a war that had devoured nations. One meal had somehow preserved a fragment of kindness. Historians may write about tanks, about treaties, about surrender, but history also hides in the ordinary, in the hiss of oil, the warmth of hands sharing a pan, the quiet between two men who no longer need words. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the roar of the 20th century, you might still hear it, that soft sound of humanity surviving itself.